So governments frequently use Coase bargaining and other Coasean principles like that in their policy. This is not some theoretical academic thing. It is a very well-established part of actual policy as it is implemented today. And oftentimes, what the government will do is it will award itself the property right to create a certain nuisance, particularly where pollution is concerned, and then it will sell the right off in auctions. And when they do this with carbon emissions, the nuisance, of course, being the carbon dioxide is not in and of itself a pollutant. Sulfur dioxide is, but as you all know, the nuisance of carbon dioxide would come in the form of all of the various kinds of damage caused by global warming. It is worth noting that global warming also has upsides. That point often goes completely overlooked in a lot of very, very bad analysis. Some parts of the world getting warmer, that's an improvement for them. But on the whole, even your more moderate environmental economists on that, they still do agree it is a net negative. So you have a social stake in controlling this, right? We have a negative externality. Pigou, right? The classic approach would say that you would want to address that by taxing people's carbon emissions. This is perfectly reasonable. And in fact, this might actually be a little easier to use here, but we're going to see how you would approach this from a Coase direction. So the government is going to solve this as a two-step optimization process. First, they're going to try to estimate the socially optimal level of pollution. Emissions in and of themselves are not good, but emissions are a necessary byproduct of things that are good, like production of material goods, transportation. And so they're going to try to estimate what in general, if they allow for more emissions, how much is that going to add to society in terms of its well-being? How much is that going to cost? You're going to try to identify the optimal quantity. Then the government is going to sell shares of this quantity to the general public. They auction it off, and whoever buys these shares, it is their property right. It's almost more like a lease of sorts or rent, because they don't buy it for a lifetime, right? It's like for a given year, but they then have the ability to resell this should they end up deciding that they don't actually want to go through with using it, or if they've only partially used it. Now, this is going to have two huge advantages compared to direct regulation of production. So when I say direct regulation, you might imagine, say, rules that say you're not allowed to operate a smokestack that does not have this kind of filter. You're not allowed to use this type of plastic in your material. Rules that tell you how to go about your job. Well, the advantage here is that the costs and benefits of pollution are not equal across all firms. This was an idea I raised with you when I was talking about Sturgis v. Bridgman. In that case, Sturgis cared quite a bit about the noise that Mr. Bridgman was creating. But it's easy to imagine that there might be plenty of doctors in Britain who aren't all that bothered by a little bit of noise from their neighbor's mortar. And there might be many confectioners in Britain who aren't all that bothered about moving their mortar or using a more quiet piece of equipment. If the government of Britain were to come in and say, you are not legally allowed to have a candy shop next to a doctor's office, one of you has to move in every case, then that could wind up being very inefficient because it wouldn't take into consideration that in other scenarios, people put very different values on the problem. Now, in this case, there can be very different rates of profitability at different firms. There can be very different costs associated with technological change. You might have, for example, a coal-powered power plant that's located in the middle of a very large city, and it would be very expensive to convert it into any other kind of plant. The equipment is long out of date, to the point that refurbishing it would be prohibitively expensive. But this plant, it serves a huge population, and so it would be a great loss to society if it had to shut down. Now, on the other hand, you might have another power plant somewhere else in the country that is perfect to be renovated. So, for example, I met a man at a conference once who works in nuclear policy. He's a big lobbyist for it. And he was talking about how all over Appalachia, your coal-powered power plants, they're always located next to a large source of water. And most of the expense, it comes in the form of this like fixed infrastructure, the hookups to the grid. He was talking about how one of the things he promotes when he goes and talks to state governments is the idea of converting the coal plants into nuclear plants. Because the nuclear plant, again, much of the expense just comes from the hookup to the grid, and also they're limited in terms of where you can put them because they need that water access for that cooling tower. But you see where I'm going with this. There are some locations that might be able to easily change their production techniques easily. Now, if your government comes in and just passes a law that says, okay, you're not allowed to run that dirty smokestack, or you're not allowed to burn a specific kind of fuel, or you have to do this specific chemical process, that can shut down some of these edge cases, some of these businesses that can still provide a good service to the public if you allow them to come to a natural end to their life. And at the same time, it doesn't really provide any incentive to the younger and more flexible businesses to actually make any change. But when you have an auction, if you have a business that is profitable, but it would also be very costly for them to change, what they can do is they can outbid the young business for the right to pollute. So in the textbook, it's got a mathematical example of this. It says, suppose that the EPA sets 100 tons of sulfur dioxide per company as the quota. And producer A could save $1,100 if it was allowed to make another ton. And producer B would have to increase costs by $200 if it had to cut a ton. So producer A is like that old power plant in the city, and producer B is like that one that's maybe switching over to nuclear. Well, when this goes up for auction, producer A has a much higher value for the polluting right. And so you would expect them to bid higher on the permit. And even if for some reason they wound up getting outbid by producer B, they could still always offer to buy it from producer B as long as there's this resale market. And since they can save $1,100 and producer B would only have to increase their cost of production by $200, that's the difference of $900. And that is the gains of trade for society, if they're allowed to do this. Now, importantly, note that the overall level of pollution stays the same. It's not going up, it's not going down. We have created gains from trade here just by changing who is allowed to pollute, not how much they're allowed to pollute. Producer B is forced to go more green. They're forced to adopt greener technologies and produce less emissions. But by allowing producer A to get away with being a little more dirty, they can redistribute resources to a higher value use. See, a plant being outdated doesn't always mean that it's economically inefficient, even if it might be inefficient from an engineering standpoint. Because its value to society depends on its function. What is it producing in exchange for, creating these emissions? I'll be honest, I don't really like the textbook's numbers because of course they just pulled them out of their ass. It doesn't match to any real numbers. But this is what businesses do whenever they buy their CO2 permits. Now, this also leads to a second major advantage of cap and trade, which is that it puts the pressure to innovate on the businessman. Now, when you use direct regulation, or what some of your homework readings are going to call political environmentalism next week, I'm actually going to start to use that term in this lecture. When you use direct regulation or political environmentalism, you run into this problem that businesses come to view the regulatory agency as either their enemy or, even worse, their partner. See, your competition homework goes into more detail with this, but businesses always have this incentive to try to subvert regulatory agencies to their own will. They have an incentive both to lobby the government, lobby the legislature itself, and to also try to seed regulatory agencies with their own people, their own cronies, so that they can then essentially frustrate any attempts to actually regulate them while also shutting out potential competition. And this is called regulatory capture. So I'm going to write that into your slide, regulatory capture. They capture the regulator and they use it as their own servant. Now, under a system of Coase bargaining, under a system like cap and trade, they still have an incentive to dedicate resources to regulatory capture and to rent seeking, but there are also other ways that they can lower the burden on themselves. Instead of always having this new junk forced on them, now it's up to them to figure out how they're going to cut their emissions. And they would like to cut their emissions because if they cut their emissions, then they get to cut down on the number of permits they have to buy, which means they have a higher rate of profit on it for every widget or whatever they sell. With a system of cap and trade, all of the pressure is put on the producer to figure out how they're going to comply, as well as to try to proactively find new ways to cut costs in the same way that we know producers already try to find ways to cut costs on things like labor and raw resources. In some sense, by turning the right to pollute into a resource that they must pay for, you've encouraged them to not want to pollute as much. And the same will hold true for a Pigouvian tax as well. Now, this means that your entrepreneur is now not only promoting social welfare through the product they sell, they're also promoting it through their contribution to research. And this is a concept that will appear in the homework under the name of Enviropreneurship. A portmanteau, of course, of environmental and entrepreneurship. Now, some of these enviropreneurs that you're going to hear about are more focused on conservation. Actually, they're almost all focused on conservation, at least in the book I assigned chapters from. But this can also apply to things like green energy as well. But what makes an enviropreneur is that there's somebody who essentially does not see a conflict between profit maximization and environmental quality. Instead, they have managed to turn environmental quality into a commodity that they can market, or they've turned it into a core aspect of their business strategy. For them, these two goals go hand in hand. Now, very often, political environmentalism in the Western world tends to be very heavily influenced by more collectivist ideologies as well as ascetic ideologies. And so it tends to have this skepticism about business, a skepticism that goes beyond just the externalities that business generates. But enviropreneurship doesn't view it that way. And it tends to argue that your environmental policy is never going to be successful unless you can bend the will of business towards these goals. And so this is another goal of cap and trade. You put the pressure on the market to find a solution to these problems. And it's generally going to be more efficient because most applied R&D, most applied technology is much more efficiently developed by the market. For the reason why anything is more efficiently done by the market. In the market, it's possible to fail. In the market, your technologies, your inventions, your research has to be able to turn a profit in order for the business to continue to exist. That's why a lot of government institutions and a lot of state-run companies in various countries will often be very inefficiently run, incompetent at what they do. They're not allowed to fail. Now, we can use these tradable allowances, we can use this Coase bargaining to also clean up the environment by itself. And this is something that we call free market environmentalism. Free market environmentalism, the use of markets to promote environmentally healthy outcomes. And one way that we see this happening with cap and trade is there's no rules about who can buy carbon permits. So it's not like only factories are allowed to buy them. Private citizens can and have bought carbon permits just to not use them. There are environmentalist charities, NGOs, that will go and buy permits just so that the industrialists can't have them because that charity disagrees with the EPA and they feel that the EPA is being too generous, it's being too lax. And so this is one upside of cap and trade as well. In some ways, it kind of makes our economic planning a little more democratic in that it gives people the ability to influence the outcome even when they're outvoted because they can vote with their wallet. And we're going to see that in a very dramatic way in our next two examples. So, for example, out in the Pacific Northwest, really in the Western US in general, they have huge problems with water resources. So in the Eastern US, water is something we don't generally think about. Occasionally, there are conflicts over it. So, for example, the state of Georgia has a long-running feud, a border dispute with the state of Tennessee, because Georgia wants to divert more of the Tennessee River away to feed Atlanta. But for the most part, the Eastern US is such a lush land that folks have largely been allowed to just draw off as much as they want. In the West, on the other hand, most of the country is covered by this brutal rain shadow. A lot of your water comes from groundwater aquifers, something that, as we cover the tragedy of the commons, you'll see why that's a little alarming. And in general, water is something that is worth fighting and even dying at times over. And in an environment such as that, they ended up developing a legal doctrine called riparian water doctrine. And the way it works, in brief, is that if you could control a stretch of river, you have the right to determine what you do with that river. So there is essentially an externality here. If you were to divert more of the water away from the river, that would leave less flowing downstream for others. And the state here has come down and explicitly awarded the property right to people who are upstream. Now, there are all kinds of conflicting uses for water in the West. People need water for irrigation, for cropland. People need water for municipal water corporations, right? Water and sewer. And you also have, disturbingly, what I call the fish huggers. A fish hugger is a lot like a tree hugger, except slimier. I'll tell you, I can't understand the mindset of a fish hugger. It's a dark thing, and I don't try to probe it too much. But there are a lot of conservationists who, for whatever reason, they have a big stake in protecting the salmon of the Northwest. These river salmon that will migrate from upstream to downstream every year. The ones you see in the movies that the bears, will hang over the river and prey on them. Now, why do the fish huggers care about the rivers? Well, they want more river for natural habitat. The more of it that gets diverted to crops, diverted to human use, the less there is for the fish and for their hatcheries. Now, under a system of political environmentalism, what you would get is people would elect some representative official who would appoint some permanent civil servants, what Donald Trump liked to call the deep state. The rest of the world calls the civil service, right? Permanently employed government bureaucrats get their positions by exam. Well, these Mayday, Mayday. 1, 2, 3. Well, these people would then choose some kind of policy. And if we were fortunate, they would choose a policy that perhaps is somewhat moderate. Usually extremes tend to be bad, right? Somewhat moderate and somewhat equitable to all parties involved. However, politics is anything but. In politics, everyone gets essentially an equal say, at least as far as their ballots count. They get essentially an equal say on matters, regardless of how strongly they feel about them, or how informed they are about them, or how much it actually directly impacts their own life. In politics, if you can get a majority or a supermajority, it depends on the specific voting rules of your legislature. If you can control the political system, you can completely shut out any inputs from the party that loses, even if they still command the support of a good chunk of the public. And so political environmentalism tends to result in this very black and white, all or nothing thinking, which in turn often leads to it sort of radicalizing itself and taking on these quasi-religious tones. And it often ends in very punitive outcomes for the party that loses. And sometimes the party that loses is the environmentalists, and sometimes it's the anti-environmentalists. Now, what happens under a system of riparian water? Well, you've got at least three uses for the water that I suggested. Everyone wants the water. The water belongs to people who are up the river. And so, how are they going to get access to the water? They're going to start to bargain. They're going to have to go to the water owners and make them offers. And they're going to have to vote with their money. They put their money where their mouth is. And what we tend to find is that you end up getting much more moderate, reasonable, and equitable distributions of these water rights when everyone has to compete with each other. So the fish huggers, they end up buying out stretches of river to keep as salmon hatcheries. They get to keep hatcheries for their fish, but they don't get to just greedily grab up an entire river. Likewise, your farmers, they too will get access to some water, but they don't get to grab up the entire river. And the cities don't get to grab up the entire river. Because when people are forced to pay out of their own pocket for things, they tend to be a lot more honest with themselves about their own valuation. If it was free to grab up more of it because you never pay the bill yourself, you impose it all on the taxpayer, then you're likely to demand a much larger share. But when you've got to reach into your own wallet, that tends to force you to really consider if it's really worth it to you. Because of this, there's also a lot less resentment under a system of riparian water doctrine. Because everybody gets a piece, and because it all comes out of this sort of free trade with one another, as opposed to some solution that's imposed, people don't tend to feel like they have been robbed or wronged as much because they didn't get it all. They tend to be more grateful for the portion of it that they do get, and they're also more inclined to continue to trade and bargain and try to come to terms with each other further down the line. This is an idea that Ridley talks about a bit. There are certain social pathologies in our day that are very troubling, but in general, widespread violence and strife have been on the decline over that roughly 1800 to 1900 period, at least in America. There is a sort of softening of civil society that you get from an extension of commerce. And finally, one last thing I wanted to note with this, you also get a system that is a lot more stable. Now, that's one thing that can be very surprising to people because, again, often we tend to think of markets as being chaotic by nature. But the thing is, when your policy is entirely at the will of the current government, the policy can be changed overnight. Markets evolve over time. People's preferences change, our capabilities as a society change, but it's generally much more gradual of a process. What you don't see in markets is crap like, if you remember when Biden first took office, Trump had approved this pipeline to move oil from Canada, and Biden comes in and shuts it down on the very first day, just overnight destroying this huge project that a lot of money had already been sunk into and that was producing a lot of jobs. Now, imagine, let's suppose that you're a supporter of shutting down the pipeline then. But now imagine how it would feel if the next time the Republicans or some other less environmentalist party takes power. What's to stop them from just starting it back up overnight? This is a huge problem with democracies where the government offloads a lot of its legislative power onto the executive branch. When you have governments, both Democrat and Republican, over decades governing by executive order, you get a very chaotic business environment because one dude will just come in, sweep aside all of the legal codes, and then replace it with his own junk. It makes things very unpredictable, and you can't really conserve anything in such an environment. But when you have these stable business relationships with each other, businesses generally they don't want to keep everything the same all the time, but they live and they die based on their relationships to one another. And you're not just going to get these sorts of massive upsets where everything goes. Now, the riparian water doctrine had been a major success, although it did run into some problems. Recently, in California, the fish huggers actually managed to convince some, I think it was a local government, to take out a hydro dam. They thought that the dam was getting in the way of the fish spawning, but then when they took the dam out, it ended up killing all the fish in the river. I had a pretty good time with that. I had this like SpongeBob meme that I sent everyone. I'm gonna send it to you anyways. Happened this past spring. Anyhow, I got another example of this for you in practice. Conservationists and private businessmen working hand in hand. So out in Yellowstone, back in the 1990s, they had a big problem with wolves. Now, wolves, like most of our big critters, most of our woodland animals, they didn't do too well when the white man showed up. And the white man had killed just about everyone he could find, and then started to regret it, right? And so you get the birth of conservationism. Problem is, as the wolf population continued to rebound, as it started to recover, and as more and more people began settling the West, it was inevitable that there was going to be a bit of strife because wolves, believe it or not, are wild animals, and they like to eviscerate other wild animals, namely cattle. So Wyoming is cattle country. You got ranches all around Yellowstone. And wolves would frequently wander out of Yellowstone National Park onto private ranches, kill a cow, eat like half of it, and then wander off. And the cattle ranchers were furious, and rightfully so, because they're suffering a financial loss for every cow they lose, much less the suffering that the poor beast goes through. And cattlemen began to deal with this the way farmers always have with pests and varmints, which is to shoot at everyone they could see. Just like you would do with the fox, just like you would do with a gopher in your garden, they begin hunting wolves, calling wolves, even when it ain't exactly legal. It's not that easy to prove who poached that wolf. And as far as they saw it, they were defending their property. So this fella, Hank Fisher, he's not in the photo. That's unrelated. Hank Fisher realizes he needs to solve this because all of that progress they had made with the wolves, that could easily go up in flames. And he gets together this bunch called the Defenders of Wildlife Compensation Fund. That also deserves to be in your slide. Defenders of Wildlife Conservation Fund. Now, this bunch, they have a somewhat different approach. Most of the conservationists, what they're inclined to do is they'll run straight to the public, cry about all of the dead doggies, and try to get a law passed. But Fisher understood the mentality of a rancher. And he understood that these people are not just like spiteful, evil Disney cartoon villains. They have a very real grievance. In some sense, they have been wronged. And the best way that they can move past this is if he recognizes that. And so Fisher's organization goes to the cattle ranchers with a proposition. All right, You feel wronged every time you lose a cow. We feel wronged every time a wolf gets killed. What we'll offer is, as long as there are wolves, there are always going to be cattle being killed. So we'll pay you a set amount for every dead cow. You have to provide proof it was a wolf kill. And if we find that you killed a wolf, you owe us money. So they know that on the whole, the conservation fund, that's actually probably compensation fund. Compensation fund, I'm sorry. They know that on the whole, uh, they're going to be paying most of the money, but they also have to include this other clause so that the ranchers actually do have an incentive not to shoot. Now, initially, the ranchers are pretty suspicious, but they're willing to give this a try. And over time, they the defenders of wildlife are always good to their word. They always pay up like they say they will. And so once the ranchers understand that they will honor their agreement, the ranchers are more than happy to honor their agreement. They're even making somewhat of like a slight profit off of this. And so they kind of help them to cultivate the wolf population. But the wolf population manages to expand even as the cattle ranchers' profits are also expanding. Now, who's funding this? Basically, private charity. Rich men, rich philanthropists who have an emotional stake in protecting this natural resource. You're going to meet another one of them in Excludability and Rivalry when we talk about Ted Turner, very famous tycoon of the 20th century. But the system worked wonders. The wolf population was booming. The cattle ranchers were happy. Industry and environmentalists had come together on a project that was building up more trust, that was getting them more invested in helping each other, even on other projects. And everything was great until the government came in. Because the government saw that it was such a good project that they just knew that they had to improve on it. And they nationalized it, dramatically lowered the payments. And then the cattle ranchers, who were no longer being meaningfully compensated, began shooting wolves again. For as long as this had remained a purely private exercise, things were going fine. But when it started to become a political thing, that's when it all began to fall apart. Now, everything I've said up until this point has been making out Coase bargaining like it's just the best thing in the world, and it is. But Coase bargaining is very contextual. There are specific conditions that have to hold in order for it to be possible to do. And specifically, there are two ways that Coase's theorem can break down. The first is that Coase requires clear and enforceable property rights. Now, this one's just kind of common sense. But if you have a property right that you can't actually back up, there's no way to actually drag someone into court over it and sue them because they didn't honor their word. Or if it's just incredibly vague who has the right, then you're not going to be able to bargain. Because people are not going to make payments for property that isn't really their property. Maybe you know someone who at some point got scammed. They got sold a piece of property that they didn't really own. Well, yeah, you wouldn't want that to happen to you, right? This is the main problem with Coase bargaining in day-to-day life. Oftentimes you have situations where there may not be any particular like case law already on the books dealing with it, and the government hasn't explicitly blessed the deal. And so there's this uncertainty. You have to worry. What if they ride in and just screw everything up like they did in Yellowstone? Now, the other big problem that can sink a coast bargain is what's called transaction costs. Now, transaction costs are a bit of a broad concept. They include everything that goes into the cost of buying something besides just the price. It's basically the price of haggling. Now, that includes any lawyer's fees for mediation. It includes time. It's mostly time. In anything that makes the bargain more expensive to you or more unpleasant to try to do. And this is going to be the real killer. So imagine if you had a problem, like, for example, factory pollution in a city. Imagine you have someone who is actually, you know what? Let's do it with like a paper mill on a river. Imagine you have a paper mill that is dumping effluent straight into the river, just like that Cuyahoga River we talked about. And that water flows downriver into kind of a lake area where you have a residential community. And the paper mill stinks, right? They have a reputation just like pork industries do. The paper mill causes the lake to just absolutely reek. It kills the fish. It taints the fish to where even if you do catch one, you wouldn't want to eat it. It makes people sick if they get in the water. It effectively ruins the value of all of those lakeside properties. Now, imagine if the families that live along that property all had to bargain with the paper mill. Now, if the paper mill owned the right, then the paper mill would have to kind of sell it to them collectively, right? They can't just pollute the water in front of one person's house. They're screwing up the entire lake or they're not screwing it up at all. And so the only way you can get a bargain struck is if everyone agrees to it. But the problem is it's very, very hard to get everyone to agree to anything. There's always going to be people in a given group who have really weird kind of fringe opinions. There's always going to be holdouts who, this especially comes up in eminent domain. There's always going to be these holdouts who they fully intend to give in, but they're trying to like strategically wait so that the other party gives them a better deal in desperation. And you always have what's called free riders. And we're going to talk about free riders more in the next topic, but like that's a common expression in English. You all know what I mean when I say free riders. They know that at the end of the day, their decision to pay doesn't make a huge difference to the overall amount. And so they could just refuse to participate in the bargain, knowing that other people are going to solve their problem. Except the problem is, if enough people are like that, if enough people do that, you never get a bargain struck in the first place. So you have all of these different problems coordinating large groups of people. And this is going to mean that a coast bargain is basically impossible to strike because it is just so difficult to coordinate everyone. It's so difficult to reach the unanimous agreement necessary to implement the policy. Now, there are ways that you can simplify this. very often in the real world, if you had a problem like this, you might be coast bargaining with a local government, for example. The town would haggle with the factory on behalf of the citizens. Or you would have potentially things like landlords or real estate developers. If there's a homeowners association, they're going to be arguing on behalf of their people. I think I told y'all about the racetrack that moved in near my house back home, and the retirement community, right? They're the ones who are dealing with the racetrack, not the individual landowners. The total number of people affected doesn't really matter so much as the total number of distinct legal identities matters. You could have like a city of 10 million people that's affected, and as long as they were all being represented by one legal face, you could still solve this problem. But very often we have situations where that's just not true. And so because of this, the whole idea of coast bargaining is going to really be limited to these sort of intimate local problems. It's going to be limited to cases where you might imagine there being a lawsuit, but not like a class action lawsuit. Situations where one business has hurt another business or where one neighbor has hurt another neighbor. But you're not going to be able to use this with things like air pollution or pollution of the ocean. Because with that ends up affecting so many people. It effectively affects entire cities, entire countries, even the whole world when you're talking about global warming. Global warming in particular can be thought of as like the worst case scenario for this because you got over 6 billion people on this earth. That's like the figure I always grew up with. It's probably well over that by now. Billions of people on this earth. And even if you did the coast bargaining just between their countries, you've got 195 different countries to negotiate with and no ability to enforce it because there is no meaningful international law. The United Nations is a joke. It's about as meaningful as like the model UNs that students do. And this is one huge mistake that a lot of environmentalists end up falling into because you can try to optimize your environmental policy within your own country, and that works with things like water quality, smog, acid rain, junk like that. But with something like global warming, it doesn't matter who made the CO2. All that matters is the total amount of it being produced worldwide. And if you make it harder for your businesses to operate in your own country, they're going to move overseas. If they're operating in the first world, like America or Japan or Europe, places that are wealthy and fairly clean, then they're operating there for a reason. It's more profitable to do so. But if you raise their cost of operation too much, if you make their job too difficult, they will move. And they'll move to a place like India or China that has no standards at all. Now, there are ways that this can be dealt with. So, for example, you might not be able to levy Pigouvian taxes on the Chinese, but you could levy a Pigouvian tariff on imports from China. The funny thing is, the same parties that tend to support harsher environmental regulation here also tended to oppose the trade wars. But this is what we have on a global situation. We have a global prisoner's dilemma, a situation where it would be in everybody's interest if everyone else agreed to cooperate and solve this problem, but each individual wants to cheat, or at least some countries want to cheat. So something like cap and trade, it can work in theory, but without the honest, sincere cooperation of international governments, you're just not going to be able to make that work in practice. And you're never going to be able to like coast bargain at an individual level. But in general, this is what you find. When it comes to local matters, things that you might imagine having a lawsuit over, that's where coast bargaining is going to shine. Little things that are kind of beneath the government's notice, Coase gave us this robust theory that proved that we don't have to have a central planner bothering themselves about that. But when it comes to the very big picture stuff that we worry about, Coase also showed that his approach cannot solve these kinds of problems. And you're going to have to fall back on more traditional economic tools like Pigouvian taxes and Pigouvian subsidies if you're going to address them. But just to summarize the whole topic, the big idea here has been that when you have a government that sets blunt quotas or regulations, a government that meddles in the business of how you make a good, how you run your business, that is a very one size fits all mentality that ignores context. And in doing so, it ends up causing a harm to society. And we know from price controls that you almost never want to directly play with the prices. You will cause shortages or surpluses. And we know that this sort of one rule for everyone approach, that's wasteful, but at the same time, we can't leave it up to public officials to have this sort of discretionary power. So what we have to do as a culture is fall back on these alternative methods. In the small things of life, it's going to mostly be coast bargaining. It's going to mostly be allowing people to plan for themselves, just like they already do in every other aspect of their life. Creating legal systems that are set up to make this convenient, set up to make it clear who owns what, and to give people the ability to work and mediate with each other to solve these sorts of problems. And in the bigger things, that big top tier policy, like what are we going to do about the air? What are we going to do about global warming? What are we going to do about the ocean? That's the kind of stuff where then we've got to fall back on Pigou, taxes and subsidies. But what both of them are all about is internalizing that externality. Because whichever way we do it, whether we do it the more government intervention-y way or the more market way, either way, the goal is to make people take into consideration the effect they have on others by making them sort of empathize with them. But instead of doing this psychologically, you do it by, beating them down. you beat them down financially. This might sound really sappy or cheesy or something, but honestly, to me, there's almost like this profound moral message to it, right? It's like if we always thought that way, if we always internalized what we did to others, there wouldn't be any suffering in this world, would there? But we're humans, we're monsters. I haven't really gone that deep with that with you yet, but you'll get that by the end of the class. Man is a monster. And this may be the this may be the best we can do on Earth. It's the best we're going to make out of this world. But in the next video, I'll be talking about excludability and rivalry. So we're going to continue with this environmental econ theme. Just like how this topic wasn't all about environmental issues, the next one isn't going to be all about that either. But we're going to talk a lot more about animals because all of the really fun tragedy of the commons examples involve animals. So I know from experience that y'all tend to really like that stuff. So I'll see you on Monday.